Russia steals. And not only Ukrainian plumbing, culture, and history, it steals the most valuable thing from Ukraine, Ukrainians. If it weren't for Russia, the word deportation would have become archaic long ago.
They are stealing people. More than 1,600,000 of Ukrainians were forcibly deported to Russia. They are dispersed across the territory of this state, scattered throughout remote Russian regions. Many of them and their documents taken away. And many of them passed through terrible Russian filtration camps where they were abused and intimidated. These are people, but for Russia, it's also a resource.
In 2022, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, human rights watchers reported mass deportations of Ukrainians from Kyiv, Polisia, Slobozhanщина, Donetchina, Priazovia, and also Podniprovia and Zaporizhia regions.
No one asked us what we wanted or how we wanted it. If I had a choice, I would never have crossed the border with Russia. Russian soldiers came into our basement in the morning and said that if we didn't leave, we'd be shot.
The Russian military is destroying Ukrainian cities and towns and preventing Ukrainians from fleeing to the territories under Ukraine's control. Additionally, the occupiers are mass deporting Ukrainians to Russia, calling this evacuation, and referring to those deportees as refugees. Meanwhile, the evacuation of civilians and foreigners continues along the Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Mariupol directions. With these phrases, they try to hide the fact that deportations are Russia's deliberate policy, which it inherited from the Soviet Union. A totalitarian regime that during its 69 years of existence carried out nearly 110 rounds of deportations, which forcibly displaced almost 6 million innocent people. So when Russia says we can repeat it, they are repeating these imperialistic scenarios. The so-called Russian world brings occupation, oppression, and genocide to free countries. During World War II, the Soviet Union occupied the Baltic countries twice. Both times, in order to eliminate resistance from the local people who wanted independence, the Soviet regime carried out mass deportations. The first deportation took place in the summer of 1940. Soviet troops entered the Baltic countries, established controlled governments, and initiated mass cleansing, or filtration measures, as they would say now. People from the Baltic countries were stigmatized as traitors and were accused of engaging in so-called anti-revolutionary activity and anti-Soviet agitation.
Children cried terribly and ran to their parents. Wives rushed to their husbands, but soldiers pushed everyone away. Dainora Urboniene still doesn't know exactly what the Soviet authorities accused her parents of. It is likely that the fact that both of them were teachers and therefore belonged to the Lithuania intelligentsia was enough to raise suspicion.
From Lithuania alone in 1940, more than 10% of the country's population was deported to Siberia. Even the presidents of Estonia and Latvia were forcibly displaced and later died in deportation.
The Genocide and Lithuanian Resistance Research Center in Vilnius has collected documents and artifacts from those times. After the arrival of Soviet power in 1940, more than 200,000 Lithuanians, more than 10% of the population, were deported to Siberia.
According to various estimates, a total of 140,000 to 300,000 people were forcibly deported from the Baltic countries. In their official documents, the Soviet authorities openly used the term deportation and reported on the implementation of their operational plan for the extraction of anti-Soviet contingents. About 50 years later, a new generation of Soviet authorities recognized those very deportations as unlawful. But in 2020, Russia's President Vladimir Putin brings back the aggressive rhetoric And for this, we will strive for the demilitarization and Nazification of Ukraine. In his article marking the 75th anniversary of victory over Nazi Germany, he called the Soviet occupation of the Baltic countries a legitimate annexation.
So strange that South and North Korea are located on the other side of the globe. But for some reason we live here. It was incomprehensible for me as a child, and this issue was not addressed in any way. Only recently got an explanation that the Koreans were deported from the Far East and resettled in Central Asia.
At the beginning of the 20th century, many Korean farmers moved to the Far East regions of the USSR, fleeing from Japanese occupation. But in September 1937, the Soviet authorities suddenly decided that the ethnicity of these immigrants was confusing. According to official statements, people could not distinguish Korean people from Japanese people. And in order to prevent infiltration of Japanese spies, the authorities forcibly displaced 172,000 ethnic Koreans to uninhabited wasteland regions of Kazakhstan and Central Asia. When the deportees arrived in Kazakhstan, they were also forced to forfeit their Korean names and adopt Russian ones. Ethnic Germans in Ukraine also suffered from the Soviet repressions on the basis of ethnicity. As a reminder, the first settlements of Germans in Ukrainian territory date back as early as the 11th century. And in the 18th century, there were several large waves of immigrants from religious conflicts. At this time, Germans in Ukraine were given land allotments, exempted from taxes for 10 years, and free from the mandatory military service forever. On the eve of World War II, approximately 500,000 Germans lived in Ukraine. And suddenly, after Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they all became enemies of the state. Soviet authorities mass deported Germans from Ukraine to the north and far east of the USSR territory. Those people who were registered as anti-Soviet elements were arrested. Able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60 were sent to labor camps. The German people who had lived in Ukraine their entire lives were accused of collective guilt on ethnic grounds. And as a result of repression, by the end of the war, there were almost no Germans remaining in Ukraine. The administrative ban on Germans returning to Ukraine was lifted no sooner than in 1972, 27 years after the end of the Second World War. It was after the forced removal of Germans that deportations in the Soviet Union went to another level. Driven by paranoid suspicions of the population's collaboration with the enemy, the NKVD forcibly resettled about 400,000 Chechens in 8 days in February of 1944. They were accused of mass collaboration with Nazi occupiers, despite the fact that the invaders only took control over a small region in the far northwest of the Republic. The deported Chechens were scattered throughout the country and placed in the special settlements, which they were not allowed to leave any further than a couple of kilometers. They were forced to work on the collective farms and in factories for a minuscule salary, despite their hard physical labor. They were not allowed to use their native language. The Chechen children attended only Russian primary schools. Following their deportation, the Chechen people were labeled as traitors of the motherland. This nation spent 13 years in forced exile. In 1957, the Soviet authorities finally cleared the Chechens' reputation and allowed them to return to their homeland. The Soviets also initiated cleansing of the Crimean Peninsula of its native inhabitants. In April 1944, Lavrentiy Beria, the chief of the NKVD, wrote a report to Joseph Stalin where he accused Crimean Tatars of mass desertion from the Red Army. Shortly after this, between the 18th and 21st of May, Crimean Tatars were forcibly removed to Middle Asia and the Ural region. I am from Crimea myself, a Crimean Tatar. My parents are also from Crimea, but they were already born in deportation. My father was born in Central Asia. I was also born in Central Asia. But my grandfather, my grandmother, they were all born in Crimea. They were falsely accused of mass treason and collaboration during the time of German occupation. The Soviet authorities deported even those Tatars who had served in the Red Army and were officially discharged. That is, deportation was one of their instruments of genocide. According to official figures, in 1944, the Soviet regime deported approximately 20,000 Tatars. According to the Crimean Tatar National Movement, the number of deportees is twice as high. According to various estimates, between 20% and 46% of all deported Crimean Tatars died from starvation, exhaustion, or illnesses during the first 3 years after deportation. Soviet authorities did not stop there. In 1944, they carried out another mass ethnic cleansing and deported Bulgarians, Armenians, and Greeks from Crimea. Less than 2 months later, the Soviet regime allowed 51,000 people from other regions to relocate to Crimea, mostly Russians. They were offered the empty houses of the displaced Crimean Tatars to live in. Joseph Stalin was so determined to eradicate any trace of Crimea's indigenous people that he banned the use of the ethnonym Crimean Tatars. For over 40 years, any mention of Crimean Tatars in Soviet censuses was prohibited. The ban on their return to the peninsula remained in effect until November 1989. Today, Ukraine and the Baltic countries recognize the 1944 deportation of Crimean Tatars as an act of genocide. In the 1990s, many Tatars began to return en masse to the peninsula. Crimea is Ukraine. Firstly, we feel free here. It's the most important thing. You breathe differently here, you know? In 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, many of them had to leave their homeland once again. The Russian authorities officially declared the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people to be an extremist organization. Just as they did in 1944, in 2014, Russians started to move into Crimea once again. These actions of the Soviet Union and its successor, Russia, stem from their deliberate policy of forced assimilation of indigenous peoples. This is how a country infected with imperial aspirations tries to distort history and appropriate the things it never owned. Our objective is to participate in spiritual and religious pursuits so that the Crimean Tatars, who were forced to leave their homeland, would preserve their identity here, in mainland Ukraine. Ukrainians still suffer from deportations. The processes of forced removal restarted in 2014, when Russia occupied Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. After the full-scale invasion, the deportations of Ukrainians reached a new level. Millions of Ukrainians ended up outside of Ukrainian territory against their will.
Edward was inside when his apartment was shelled. He was injured and evacuated. At a checkpoint, he asked to go to western Ukraine.
I told the woman that I wanted to go to Zaporizhia, but she answered that there is no Zaporizhia anymore. A Russian military man was standing nearby, who said that Kyiv had already surrendered.
One of the motives behind this Russian crime is their demographic crisis. The fact is, the share of ethnic Russians in the overall population of the country is declining sharply. That's why the Russian authorities want to increase their numbers at the expense of ethnic Slavs. Special attention is paid to the deportation of Ukrainian children. The occupiers deport children from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including those who were orphans before this full-scale war or who lost their parents as a result of it. Even children with living parents are taken away by the Russians, as if on holiday. These children are then subjected to ideological indoctrination and are not always returned home afterwards. Other children are taken from their Ukrainian families in filtration camps and are given to Russian families for adoption. The bombing was very intensive. Russian troops entered and we were evacuated. They took me away by car and the children were taken away by bus.
And it was unclear where they were going.
Of course it was not. At first, they said that the children were just going on holiday. But there's no place to go on holiday here.
And then all of them, 31 children, were returned, right?
No. At that time, they were all adopted in Moscow.
Well, what was the scariest part of this experience for you?
Not knowing where my children were. Russian authorities do everything they can to appropriate Ukrainian children. In May 2022, Vladimir Putin signed a decree that simplified the procedure for Ukrainian children to receive Russian citizenship. Prior to that, it was forbidden in Russia to adopt foreign children. This is how Russia imitates the legality of adoption for kidnapped children that make their return to Ukraine much more complicated.
We were waiting for the bus back to the camp one day. They said to me, "Do you know that you are no longer Ukrainian? You are Russian now. Do you know that Mariupol is now Russia and not Ukraine?" I said, "It is occupied, but that doesn't make me Russian. I was born in Mariupol, Ukraine, so I'm Ukrainian."
According to this new procedure, potential adoptive parents have to undergo special training where they will be taught nuances of ideological education for Ukrainian children, among other things. After adoption, the new parents are required to change the full name of the adopted Ukrainian child. Russian authorities openly promote this alleged salvation of children. A prominent example, Maria Lvova-Belova, Children Rights Commissioner for the President of the Russian Federation and the head of the initiative Into the Hands of Children. In the autumn of 2022, she herself illegally adopted a child kidnapped from Mariupol. Such actions by Russia violate the Geneva Convention on the Protection of Civilians during wartime. The Russian Orthodox Church is also engaged in the ideological re-education of deported Ukrainian children. It promotes the myth about the Russian world and united Orthodox Slavic nation. Practically every region of Russia where Ukrainians are brought has its own diocese, which takes care of the issues of alleged evacuees. Deported Ukrainians are stationed in monasteries and other facilities belonging to the church, where they are subjected to educational and enlightening talks. According to information obtained by the hacker groups Anonymous and DDO Secrets, at the beginning of the full-scale war, the Russian Orthodox Church was making preparations for deportation long before the actual invasion. The Russian Ministry of Defense, along with some other Russian sources, reports that during the first 11 months of the full-scale war, more than 733,000 children from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine were allegedly saved. They are resettled across the entirety of Russia, including Sakhalin Island.
1,090 orphans from various children's institutions came to us. So, what is your opinion? Our citizens have, of course, big hearts, and they are already lining up to take the children in. If you allow, I will continue this work. We have already created a register of those who have documents, and some perhaps could be temporarily placed, some with Russian citizenship could already be accommodated.
Why only with Russian, with any citizenship?
There just is some bureaucracy which needs to be eliminated then.
You say which one, we will liquidate it. These are extraordinary circumstances, and we should think not about some red tape, but about the interests of children. The figures published by Maria Lvova-Belova from time to time do not match the official reports of her own Into the Hands of Children organization. This indicates deliberate concealment of the facts of deportation. The reported information of deported Ukrainian children is growing rapidly, but unfortunately very few of them are supported by any official data. Ukrainian human rights defenders and law enforcement officers check any information about deported people. The specialized portal Children of War reports that as of today, the names of approximately 15,000 of the deported children have been confirmed. On the 17th of March, 2023, the International Criminal Court, seated in The Hague, issued arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova for their alleged responsibility in the war crime of unlawful deportation of children from occupied areas of Ukraine to Russia. While masking the deportations of Ukrainians behind other words such as evacuation, salvation, and holiday, Russia carries out its deliberate policy of extermination of Ukrainian people. This terrorist state must be stopped because it has no intention of halting its crimes against humanity.